To know New Orleans is to love New Orleans. Few American cities can boast the culinary excellence, richness of diversity, and joy of life that you can find in New Orleans. Unfortunately, New Orleans, as we know it, almost ceased to exist after a catastrophic hurricane named Katrina hit its shores 20 years ago this year. Katrina exposed a weakness in the social fabric of our country, and the government's ability to respond to crisis was questioned. So join us today as we look at the breakdown in the Big Easy 20 years after Hurricane Katrina. So my name is Professor Amezcua, and we've been doing some of these talks on political topics, on historical topics, and I'm joined today by my colleagues, Professor Stephen Lopez, who teaches history for Sanjak Online, and Professor William Parent, who teaches government for Sanjak Online. And today, hopefully, we're going to provide a little bit of analysis, a little bit of context as to what happened 20 years ago. So let's begin with a timeline. In August 23rd of 2005, a tropical depression formed in the Caribbean. That is not unusual. Hurricane season really starts to get going as we enter September. We know that pretty well in our part of the country. August 24th, Katrina became a tropical storm just east of Florida. On the next day, it becomes a Category 1 hurricane, which is the lowest category of hurricane. By the 26th or 27th, it had moved past Florida and into the Gulf of Mexico. And if you've been out to one of our beaches in the summer, you know how warm that water can get, which is like kerosene for hurricanes. It intensifies to a Category 5 hurricane on August 28th. And on this day, on the 28th, the National Weather Service releases what is a very ominous message. And we are not natives of New Orleans, but we've always heard the stories that it was so vulnerable because of its geography to a big storm. And the National Weather Service releases the following statement saying, "A most powerful hurricane with unprecedented strength, rivaling the intensity of Hurricane Camille in 1969. Most of the area will be uninhabitable for weeks, perhaps longer." That unfortunately was not the message that a lot of people in New Orleans were getting. So on August 29th, Hurricane Katrina makes landfall in Louisiana as a Category 3 with winds of 125 miles per hour. On the 29th, the storm makes a second landfall on the Louisiana-Mississippi border. On August 29th, the levees that were so crucial in protecting a city that sits below sea level breach, causing catastrophic flooding in the city. And on August 29th, the storm surges rise up to 28 feet, destroying communities like Bay St. Louis, Waveland, and Biloxi nearby. By August 30 and 31st, the city of New Orleans is almost entirely underwater. Thousands of people seeking refuge find themselves in the Superdome or stranded on rooftops or at the convention center. September 1st and 5th, days after Katrina made landfall, rescue operations intensify as the desperate search and delivery of food and other supplies gets stalled. Conditions worsen, and images of this are flashed not only across the country, but across the world. On September 6th and after, the floodwater slowly begins to be pumped out of New Orleans. The recovery begins, and even 20 years later, the city has not recovered. This is the path that Hurricane Katrina followed. It started out just like so many other storms that we pay close attention to where we live on the Gulf Coast that unfortunately veered off into the Gulf and almost was a direct hit into Florida, into Louisiana. So let's look at the aftermath. The 28-foot surge in Mississippi was one of the highest ever recorded in the United States. At points, 80% of the city of New Orleans was underwater. And the image that I chose as our title slide showed you just how catastrophic it was, how overwhelming it was. An estimated 1,800 people lost their lives across Louisiana, Mississippi, and surrounding areas. And the estimates of 125 million in damages still make it one of the costliest hurricanes that we've ever experienced. And over 1 million people were displaced, the largest since the Dust Bowl migrations. So we titled our presentation Breakdown in the Big Easy because there were breakdowns all around. And I wanted to start off by asking our panelists, maybe Professor Dr. Lopez, we could start with you. What are your individual recollections of Hurricane Katrina? What do you remember?
Well, I think, we remember hurricanes, right? Sometimes we forget, but no one can forget Katrina. I think as it, sort of moved over Florida into the Gulf, and then started to intensify, you could hear the fear in the weather broadcasters that this thing is growing and it's heading toward Louisiana. Um, Putting out that warning. It happened to be Labor Day weekend in the Big Easy. You had big football games going on. You had people on Bourbon Street, and the reluctancy of the local leaders and Mayor Nagin and others to sort of, take this warning seriously, and just the fear that they were sending out. Look, you're going to have to do something. And I think that breakdown, not hearing the warning, uh, you know, sort of looking at, it was a big weekend. We didn't want to lose money. We don't want to turn people away. And how do we evacuate a city, of some 800,000 uh, uh, in just several days?
Yeah, the you can't get larger and more intense than Category 5. And we, living where we live, we're on permanent guard, aren't we? Whenever hurricane season rolls around, we've had our share. But this seemed like to be the most monster storm that we can imagine that was going to hit a very vulnerable area. But like you said, New Orleans is it's special for a lot of reasons, but one of those is its resilience. And despite the warnings, despite that, people were used to this, like just like we're used to this here, and people were living their lives. Professor Parent, what do you remember
Yeah,
about Hurricane Katrina?
absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Professor Amezcua and Dr. Lopez. This 20 years, that's quite a long time here. And for many of the people perhaps viewing this, students, you may not have even been alive, but this hurricane truly changed so much, not only in the Gulf Coast, in New Orleans, Louisiana, Mississippi, but also right here in Texas, specifically the greater Houston area. And I just wanted to point out a few things here. So it is surprising that as many hurricanes as New Orleans has faced throughout its history, Katrina represents the first ever mandatory evacuation when the mayor at the time, Ray Nagin, called for that mandatory evacuation. And you talk about individual recollections. My individual recollection with Katrina was at first they dodged a bullet. I remember watching those media images coming in that when it came to wind damage, Katrina was not that impactful. Of course, we know later that day on the 29th, that's when the levees ultimately were breached a few hours after it hit with that Category 3 storm at around 6:10 a.m. So obviously, as the days went by, we saw how severe that hurricane was with the levees breaking, and it was more of a flood event than a wind event. But my individual recollection of Katrina is actually more related to Hurricane Rita, which hit Houston and the Texas Gulf Coast several weeks later in September, on September 24th. And at the time, my grandfather and my grandma came in from Galveston to stay at some friend's house in Houston. And we saw obviously how bad things were in New Orleans, and so I purchased nearly $100 worth of water for them. And I remember my grandfather saying, "Hey, that seems a little excessive here," but the fear was that The same thing could happen to us, as Rita at the time was a Category 5 storm headed our way. Ultimately, it did weaken to a Category 3. So there were a lot of Houstonians just a few weeks later who had Katrina in their mind as Rita was coming. And we'll talk more about Rita, but that's interesting to see how those two were ultimately connected 20 years later.
Yeah, my recollection of this period is just seeing the images on television, the masses of people at the Superdome. You know, the Superdome, when it was built, was a marvel of architecture, and it still hosts Super Bowls and important events. It's still something that that area is very proud of. And with no electricity, with no supplies, it just became like this house of horrors during that period. The images of what we saw was of disorder that we saw just beamed to everyone across the country. So it was like a feeling of helplessness. Like I can't believe that this is happening in our country. So that's a perfect segue into the next topic that I want to discuss is so there was clearly an infrastructure breakdown. I don't think that that's even up for debate. But I wanted to ask, and maybe again we could start with Dr. Lopez, is would you attribute the breakdown that what happened? Was this because of a natural disaster that this was there was nothing that could have been done to ameliorate the situation, or was this a man-made breakdown in your view?
Yeah, if you think of the city of New Orleans itself, it's what, 20 feet below sea level. It's sort of a punch bowl. The levee system that was built by the Army Corps of Engineers said it could withstand up to a Category 3 hurricane. Unfortunately, it was the levees that really caused the flooding as the water rose so quickly, with 80% of the city being flooded and underwater, catching many of those residents that did stay in the floodwaters. There was no evacuation. High ground was far away. Many of the people took to the rooftops to higher ground. They fled to the overpasses, freeway system, looking for higher ground because of the lack of infrastructure uh, damage, no lights, no power. The pumping system had broken down. These people are now trapped. The National Guard, Louisiana National Guard, was deployed overseas at the time in Iraq. Many of the police, first responders had also evacuated the city. There was just not enough individuals to sort of respond quickly without the infrastructure there, just simply not enough high vehicles, trucks, boats, etc. And then it becomes a disaster. This sort of disaster unfolding. People are now stranded without water, without food, in the heat, without medical services, without electricity, and the slow response by not only city, state, and federal officials to respond. The enormity of the disaster. I think we saw where uh, the FEMA Director Brown and the mayor didn't even know there were people at the convention center. Some 20,000 people took refuge at the convention center. And then 2 days later, realizing, oh, we got another group besides the Superdome and to deal with, and not including those trapped in the roofs and heading to higher ground along the freeway system without water, without food, in the heat, without shade.
And Professor Parent mentioned the, what we learned from this and the what changed even in our area. And even though they had ordered a mandatory evacuation, this is something that Dr. Lopez and I had talked about before recording, is they had fleets of buses that they could have used, but what happened with many of the police and many of the people who could have driven that? Would you care to elaborate on that, Professor Lopez, Dr. Lopez?
Yeah, one of the things that they mentioned is that they did have buses, but no drivers.
Right.
Many of the drivers had also evacuated. So yes, you had vehicles, you had drivers, you had boats, but no one to sort of man those vehicles. So it was sort of the, like we see in many disasters, individuals stepping up, helping each other, provide some immediate relief. The Coast Guard was brought in, the military was brought in several days later. But by this time, it's been 3 days, 4 days, and now people are just sort of stranded. So maybe, uh, you know, a better plan. I think I read about the Army Corps of Engineers had put out a hurricane preparedness plan, and the comment a year later was just a name only. There was really no prepared plan to quickly evacuate the city or sort of deal with the aftermath of the those residents who'd made a decision to stay.
Let me jump to you, Professor Parent. What do you think? Was this a natural disaster or was this man-made?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, two things can be true at the same time, and I think that applies here. Dr. Lopez, you talked about people, individuals just stepping up, and a lot of us are familiar here in the Houston area as a result of Hurricane Harvey in 2017 of the Cajun Navy, who came and helped many Houstonians, many people here in Southeast Texas get to high ground as a result of this terrible hurricane that was once again, much like Katrina, a flooding disaster, not so much a wind disaster. Well, the Cajun Navy was established in 2005 as a result of Hurricane Katrina there. And a lot of private citizens stood up and were able to provide relief and get their fellow residents to higher ground and into safety there. So when we look at Hurricane Katrina there, obviously we oftentimes focus on Michael Brown, who was the FEMA director, and President Bush, George W. Bush, famously said in the days immediately after Hurricane Katrina, Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job. Well, that narrative changed pretty quickly because, of course, Katrina hits in late August. Those levees break on the 29th. By September 12th, FEMA Director Michael Brown had resigned due to immense amount of public scrutiny and pressure. And Dr. Lopez referenced that, just not knowing the full extent of the suffering and where people in the greater New Orleans area were at in terms of needing to be evacuated there. And it does remind us that there have been a series of changes since Katrina. It was a real wake-up call. The last major hurricane that had really hit the U.S. was Hurricane Andrew in '92 that hit Florida. And so as a result of Katrina, we see that you have now individuals who serve as the FEMA director. They must have a background in emergency management. Michael Brown was a top fundraiser for George W. Bush when he ran for reelection there in 2004. And prior to this, oftentimes a president would appoint individuals who were strong supporters, but maybe not lacking that expertise in emergency management. We also now know that the Department of Homeland Security can stage resources prior to the governor declaring a national natural disaster there. So there have been things that we've learned as a result of Katrina, and that's a positive development there because unfortunately we know that hurricanes are just a fact of life, especially as we see climate change continuing to take its toll on the planet there. Regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, over 95% of scientists believe that climate change is a direct action of man's actions there. So we probably will see more hurricanes in the future, unfortunately.
Right. And the city of New Orleans never recovered its population. And a recent a documentary that I watched about it referred to the displaced New Orleanians who either settled in New Orleans West, which is Houston, or New Orleans West, which is Atlanta, because many of the places were just never rebuilt. The places that in the lower Ninth Ward, some of the places that were the most vulnerable were never rebuilt. Something that we had mentioned in conversation was the advent of contraflow traffic to get people going on both sides out of town. That was something that contributed to the long, long lines of those who did manage to evacuate from New Orleans, but like we saw in Houston just a few weeks later. And from a recent talk that I went to, they said that some of the other preparations that they've taken is to bury power lines so that in the event of a windstorm or another major storm, that they could preserve power to places like hospitals and other, triage areas as part of the response. You mentioned the political appointment, how the FEMA director used to be like a political outpost for political appointees. Let's talk now about the political breakdown because I don't know that anybody came away, at least politically, looking good. And we often talk about politics in the form of winners and losers, but I don't think that anyone came away from their response to Hurricane Katrina really draped in glory. So, what kind of breakdowns did you see or have you observed, Dr. Lopez, coming from Hurricane Katrina? What kind of political breakdowns contributed to the disaster?
Yeah, I think it was the slow response. They thought dodging a bullet, didn't realize the levee system was needed immediate attention. I think there was an efforts to try to drop sandbags on the brakes, but so many breaks, it was just a slow process to sort of slow down the flooding and the lack of response by the governor at the time, a lot of bickering, really no plan in place by the mayor, who was giving a lot of press coverage, but had to rely on General Henry, the Southern commander of the National Guard, had to step in and try to bring some and restore order to Katrina. This sort of rumors of looting, snipers from buildings. Also added to the sort of image of things are quickly falling apart. A lot of misinformation by both state, local, federal officials, and I think it was, several days after more National Guardsmen honorace policy of, we're here to help, we're not here to shoot anyone. Yes, there was looting in the city, but what do you do? The people had no food, no water. Um, so, it was sort of everyone sort of fending for themselves, but um, many of the police officers, they had fled. The first responders, they had fled. Those that stayed had to take care of their families, were concerned about their own self and their own families. Many of them, were up for 3 or 4 days before they got any relief, and that added to sort of the breakdown of the misinformation that was coming out of the city with the press, providing false information. So I think there's multiple breakdowns, and again, without that experience in emergency management, it just led to sort of this disaster that was unfolding, which the media was projecting images of the people in the convention center, wanting food and water, and the death toll. People were dying. They were just dying on the side of the streets and buildings for a number of reasons. I think when they looked at the death toll, some 1,800 estimate, 40% was drownings, another 25% due to trauma, and then about 10 to 15% of heart-related. Most half of those were elderly, 65 years or older, because of the lack of sort of quick response.
Professor Perrin, what do you think?
Yes, absolutely. So you were talking about the political breakdown here, and of course, for President George W. Bush, his public approval plummeted in the weeks after Hurricane Katrina. So in July of 2005, so he had just been reelected. In November of 2024, he defeated the Democrat candidate John Kerry, and it was a very close election, not as close as 2000, but still close nonetheless. And in July of 2005, his job approval was 46%. Fast forward to September 13th, and his job approval had gone down to 40%. And so there are a number of reasons why his job approval was declining, in part because of the war in Iraq, March of 2003, the U.S., along with coalition partners, went into Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein from power. Gas prices were up. He tried to privatize Medicare after the 2004 presidential election. But you add on to this Hurricane Katrina and the uh, belief amongst many Americans, which is that the response was inadequate, that it was slow. This just fed into a larger narrative that the administration was not prepared for maybe a future terrorist attack or some other unforeseen event. I also want to mention you talked about the demographics of New Orleans. And so I'm big on demographics. I think it helps really kind of paint a picture here. Pre Katrina, New Orleans had 460,000 people. Post Katrina, 380,000 people. So that is a reduction of what, 80,000 people in 20 years since then. As you mentioned, there have been over 1 million people displaced, 1.3 million, over 1,800 deaths. Employed prior to Katrina, we had 186,000 people employed in New Orleans. Today, that's 169,000 people. So 20 years later, they still have not fully
Wow.
recovered. And if we look at the 7 parish metro New Orleans area, we had 1.1 million people in 2000. Fast forward to today, well, 2024, I should say, 966,000. That's a decrease of 4.1%. In addition, we know that Louisiana was the only state in the Sun Belt that actually lost a House seat as a result of the 2010 census. And of course, the Sun Belt now represents where a majority of Americans reside. That hasn't always been the case, but the Sun Belt stretches from Virginia to California. And in part, the reason for this was Katrina. Katrina exacerbated the population growth or the lack thereof, I should say, in the state of Louisiana there. So how have the demographics shifted in New Orleans? Well, we've seen the Hispanic population increase for the metro area from 5 to 14%. For Orleans Parish, and the city of New Orleans, those are interchangeable. The boundaries are the same, the population is the same. So to give some context here, the white population actually increased by 3%, the black population declined by 11%, and the Hispanic population increased by 6%, whereas the Asian population increased by 1%. New Orleans is still a majority African American city, but as you can see, 56% is far less than the 2/3 of residents who were residing in the city prior to Katrina there. And so that has major implications on the city when it comes to its tax base, its ability to business and commerce and so forth when you have fewer people residing in there. And of course, this was a benefit to the state of Texas. Texas was the biggest winner as a result of the 2010 census. We gained 4 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. In Houston alone, there were something like 100 to 300,000 evacuees from the state of Louisiana who came to the Houston area. And when we talk about the political breakdown, how were those evacuees? What was their reception like? And so in 2006, here in the city of Houston, the Kinder Institute asked Houstonians what their perception of was these New Orleans evacuees, and 49% of Houstonians said they were bad for the city. Fast forward to 2008, and 70% of Houstonians said that these evacuees were bad for the city.
Wow.
Interestingly enough, people who lived in closer proximity to evacuees had a much more positive view of evacuees because they actually knew them and the hardships that they suffered, as opposed to people who maybe lived in far remote suburbs of the greater Houston region who maybe did not have a personal connection to these evacuees.
You remind me of something very important because I started out this portion of the discussion by saying nobody really came out looking good, but I do want to highlight 2 people who did. Rick Perry and Bill White, who opened the Astrodome to evacuees who were leaving a flooded out city. And in Rick Perry, you had a very conservative Republican, and Bill White, you had he was a former Democratic, although they run nonpartisan, mayor of Houston, who came together to help people. And politically, I think the way that this all broke down is that politicians from different parties failed to set aside their differences for the good of one of the great American cities. You had the rivalry between the administration and Governor Kathleen Blanco back in the day. You had the rivalry between Governor Blanco, who apparently couldn't see eye to eye with Governor Ray Nagin. And then you had just I've heard some analysts call it neglect, but some of I'll just use their words, but I'm paraphrasing them, the neglect that the Louisiana legislature, in which they've treated the city of New Orleans, that they did not give them or help make the investments that they needed to make so that when the big one hit, they could they didn't all have to evacuate the city. They could have it could have been a softer landing than what it was, rather than people just making new lives in other parts of the country.
Yeah,
So moving, go ahead.
yeah, that's a good point because I know more than $1 billion federal aid was pumped into the city to help rebuild and sort of assist with the levee system, but there's still no guarantee the levee system will hold. The Army Corps of Engineers is still, have not guaranteed this would hold in case of another, Category 5, even a Category 3. I think they're the one recently, um, several years ago that hit wasn't as powerful, but the levee system did hold up. Um, so even though the money was allocated by the government to help rebuild, many areas are still uh, haven't been rebuilt. The lower Ninth Ward, there's still open lots,
Right.
no stop signs. A lot of the infrastructure has not been rebuilt in that area. I think the recent data said that to rebuild with the new codes and building codes, more than 375,000 to build a house in the lower Ninth Ward. It just remains empty streets and a few houses, sort of. I think they said currently one elementary schools and a couple stores. So it just, even though you see the amount of money pumped in, a lot of it was not allocated to those areas that really needed the help.
Yeah, for so many, just remembering even in real time the press conferences, the litany of press conferences, it seemed like there was a lot of covering themselves, right? Trying to say, I'm not the person who is responsible. It's, pointing fingers. And in a situation like that, I think you just need to set aside party and just say, how do we help these these very vulnerable people? And I think this is another good segue to bring us into the next topic, civil society. Professor Parent mentioned the droves of people who, on their own, decided to go help the Cajun Navy, the people with chainsaws, the people who took people in and just helped people roadside or wherever they needed help. But in many ways, we saw the breakdown of civil society too. Civil society says that you should take care of the most vulnerable, that if not government, then nonprofits and volunteer organizations and churches, but they weren't able to help. And we left behind, many of the people who were there left to fend for themselves at the convention center, at the Superdome, were the most vulnerable people, the elderly, the people who didn't have means. In what way did we fail as a community, our neighbors in New Orleans?
Well, and you did see in the aftermath of Katrina, obviously looting occurring, but you have to understand the context. People are desperate, and in many cases, where you had shootings of individuals who were just simply in some cases just they're trying to get the basic necessities. Those officers were held accountable in the years after Katrina. Um, I do want to just go ahead and address kind of the elephant in the room, which is that when we talk about Houston in particular and the evacuees coming to our region, the perception amongst many Houstonians that we saw a crime wave as a result of their presence. And there is, according to experts, there was no crime wave. There were certain crimes where you saw an uptick, but for the most part, that balanced out pretty quick. And overall, there was no crime wave as a result. There are still tens of thousands of evacuees who have decided to permanently live here in the Houston area, and you can see this on their vehicles with the Saints logo, the fleur
Yeah.
de lis there, and so that's a testament to the connection that Southeast Texas has with Louisiana, with New Orleans in particular. I can't think of a city that has had a bigger impact on Galveston and Houston than New Orleans. And I think that's a testament to both of y'all have referenced the resiliency of Louisiana and its residents. And I think we continue to see this and um, even still to this day. And thank God, because there's such a great history, culture, as you've alluded to.
Yeah, and when I watched some of these interviews of people who left and went to Houston and they thought the stay was going to be temporary, but they looked around and they said, look, the job opportunities are actually better here. The educational opportunities are actually better here for my family, for my kids. There is maybe more of that civil society that we talk about. So, kind of bringing it back to where we started is there was a real breakdown in that community. It wasn't just Mother Nature came to have a say. It was the breakdown of these other things too that contributed to the disaster that Katrina was.
Well, yes, and not to belabor the point there, but you're talking about a group of people in many cases who were on the fringes of society,
Right.
and Katrina really was able to shine a light on the challenges that existed within these communities there. And when you're living paycheck to paycheck, and Katrina takes everything away from you, it anybody would really find themselves in a tight spot there. And so civil society, yes, did break down, and it was something that was decades, centuries in the making, you could argue.
Right. And maybe I mean it's 20 years later, but I think that sometimes there's an over-reliance on civil society. The civil society is going to come in and sweep the day that the local governments and state governments don't really have to invest as much in their communities because they'll fill in that gap. And certainly in this case, it seemed to have not worked out. And partly in part because some of the things that Dr. Lopez mentioned are they also need supplies. They also need vehicles. They also need electricity, something as basic as electricity. So let's go ahead and move on to the next topic. And this is a pretty broad one. It can mean New Orleans. It can mean in Houston, Texas. It can mean elsewhere. I'll start with you, Dr. Lopez. Could a Hurricane Katrina happen again?
Sure. I think that's the big fear, that this could happen again and even be worse. Even though we've planned and prepared, you really can't prepare. It's just, just the recent storm here in Houston. It was just a category one. Um, Not only the rain, but the flooding. We're very vulnerable to flooding along the Gulf Coast. And if any category five would hit the area here in the Houston Gulf Coast, the storm surge 20 feet, water would rush in into the city of Houston. It'd be very hard to prevent something like that in a direct hit on the Houston area. I just don't think The planning, you just can't predict. There's no predictable, uh, um, preparedness and to deal with something this could be devastating to Houston or any city along the Gulf Coast. Once again, New Orleans, or it could be, you know, in Florida. As much as we plan and hope to sort of deal with these hurricanes, there's simply no predictability of what how we could prevent or even respond.
Moving over
Yeah,
to you, Professor Perrin, what do you think?
absolutely. Thank you. So there's, I mean, this isn't just a Gulf Coast problem here. Any community that is along the coast, whether it's the eastern seaboard going all the way up to New York City, think Hurricane Sandy in 2012, all the way down to Brownsville, that is fair game for our hurricane season and in the Atlantic. And we're going to see, as a result of climate change, uh, hurricanes more frequently and stronger as well. And so, like you mentioned, Dr. Lopez, uh, this is inevitable that we will see more hurricanes. And the hope is that due to building codes and so forth, preparation, that you can stage resources and help mitigate the aftermath of these these hurricanes. But to avoid them, very little you can do. You can put into place barrier islands, but that's only going to have so much of an impact.
I also agree that a storm of this magnitude can happen again, and we're seeing them. I mean, we've seen other hurricanes since Katrina hit New Orleans, as a matter of fact, and we've had just after Rita, after the scare of Rita, we had, of course, the massive flooding event with Hurricane Harvey, and then we had the wind event just last year with Hurricane Beryl. What I hope doesn't repeat itself, though, is the the lackadaisical response. That I know it's human nature to kind of not obsess about worst possible scenarios and to kind of do the proactive work that needs to be done, but hopefully we've learned the lesson that in the event of something like this in certain areas, we need to just act more decisively, that we need to set political party aside and come together, all hands on deck to save, 1,800 souls who didn't, that, and you hear some of these stories about, kids and elderly people who lost their lives because of this breakdown, that it didn't have to be that way. Did not have to be that way. So let's close this up. I'll start with you, Dr. Lopez, again. What closing thoughts about Katrina 20 years after, about breakdowns, anything that you wanted to close us out with?
Yeah, there's some recent interviews with some of the evacuees that still retain that psychological scar, the impact, the trauma. Um, when they're interviewed, even though this was 20 years ago, it's like fresh in their mind. They remember going through this, especially the younger kids who now, are in their 20s or 30s. Remember, the trauma of the flooding, the trauma of, being evacuated, going to a different place. You have no idea. Many of those individuals they evacuated had no idea where they're going. They just said, get on the bus. They could end up in Houston or San Antonio or Baton Rouge or Dallas. Losing everything. They talk about you've lost everything. You lost your home, your belongings, your mementos. All that sort of was gone. And how do you replace all that? So I think it still leaves that scar on many of those. Even the city itself, the scars are still there in the city. So that's one of the things that people who've gone through it still remember. It's like they'll never forget, and sometimes don't want to forget. I think there was a quote about people in the Ninth Ward today. They're sort of like the land that's been forgotten. They're sort of
Yep.
forgot people who were just pushed to the side. So, yeah, um, it's unfortunate um, that what we have to go through these hurricanes
Yeah, and
sometimes.
Dr. Lopez, you and I had talked about a couple of documentaries, and we don't have a sponsor on the show, so I don't want to put out any plugs. for free. But there's one on Hulu, one called Hell and High Water, and then there's another one on Netflix that are really well done that really tell the stories from the vantage of the people who survived Hurricane Katrina. Professor Parent.
Yes, so my closing thought is that the people of the Gulf Coast are incredibly resilient. And specifically, when we talk about New Orleans, what a great city, so much history, that culture that we've all experienced. And it's unfortunate to think that some of that has been lost and will never be recovered. And change is inevitable, but Katrina really, really did change the demographics of the city and altered its path. And New Orleans will be back, and it's almost back to pre-Katrina levels there. But what has been lost is a lot of that culture. And so, um, a positive attribute is that Houston benefited from those evacuees coming to our city, us getting to experience that cuisine here, and some of the stories and music and culture that those evacuees brought with them. So, my closing thought is that this is something that can happen again, and hopefully we take solace in the fact that uh, we we really need to think big picture about cuts to the federal government and what type of impact that could potentially have on our fellow citizens.
Thank you guys for your contribution today. My closing thought is that I'm so glad that we never really entertained seriously the notion of not rebuilding New Orleans, because there were those who said, you know, this is going to happen again. It is just it's going to be such a loss again if we rebuild it. It's how could you even build a city there underwater? That there was never really serious talk about doing that, and that we have rebuilt it. And yes, it's a slow process of going all the way back. But New Orleans, in a country that has so many cities that look alike, that are kind of cookie cutter, the same restaurants and the same kind of scene, New Orleans is an American original. There is no other place like New Orleans, and I'm so glad that we as a nation made the decision to rebuild it. And just like so many people have said, look, we never thought twice about rebuilding the areas affected by the California fires or the flooding in North Carolina. There was never a second thought. There should not have been one either for New Orleans. So I want to thank so much the people who tuned in to our presentation. I want to leave you with our contact information. We are going to be doing these on a regular basis. I know that Professor Parent is already suggesting that we do hurricanes for the rest of the semester. And why was that again, Professor Parent?
Yes, so of course we have the 125th anniversary of the Great Storm of 1900, the worst natural disaster to ever hit the United States. In between 8 and 12,000 Americans lost their life as a result there. So if you please tune in for more depressing episodes from us.
No. So if you have any feedback that you'd like to give us or any topics that you would like for us to discuss, those are our emails. If you'd like to contact us with any feedback or any requests for future topics. So we want to thank you very much for listening, and we hope that our presentation was informative, and we will talk to you in the very near future.